22nd wedding anniversary, and it has been my custom for many, many years on that wedding anniversary to preach a sermon that is related to marriage. And I want to do that again today. As I've been studying for this particular message, it came to my memory about a song that was popular some years ago, recorded by country music star Johnny Lee, "Looking for Love in Too Many Places." And usually that meant looking for love in all the wrong places. And so I've titled the message this morning, "Looking for Love in the Right Place." There is a right place to find married love that is in harmony with God's teaching and that is meant for our happiness. Sometimes I hear basketball fans today debate who's the greatest. Is it LeBron James or was it Michael Jordan? But for many of us, I guess this speaks of age, but for many of us, I include myself, I can remember when I was a boy that the premier basketball player in the NBA was a man named Wilt Chamberlain. And Wilt Chamberlain played for the Los Angeles Lakers. In fact, I had a little book written for children, inspirational type message, all about Wilt Chamberlain and what he had accomplished in the NBA. Now, Wilt Chamberlain, because of his athletic ability and the fame and the fortune that came with that, would be the first to tell you that it also caused him a lot of harm, particularly with regard to the lusts of the flesh. Thousands of women desired to be with Wilt Chamberlain, and he allowed himself to be involved with many. But Wilt Chamberlain, before he died, and he died in his early 60s, before the man who never married died, he said, "I would have given up all of those relationships to just have had one that really counted. Just to have had one woman that I knew was committed to me and I to her, one woman with whom I could have shared every dream I ever had." He said, "I would have given up all those other relationships just for that one woman." Far too many looking for love in all the wrong places. We want to look for love, whether it be marital or some other love, in the right place. Now, we've become accustomed to studying the 4 Greek words for love: eros, romantic love; storge, familial love; phileo, brotherly love; agape, godlike love. There is one relationship where each of these categories of love are expressed. Only one. It is the relationship between a husband and a wife. And so when we consider what the Bible teaches about marriage, let's just consider for a moment, by way of introduction, what we have discussed in times past. We know that when we study the Bible, marriage is honorable. Hebrews 13:4, marriage is honorable in all, the marriage bed undefiled. Not only that, we know that marriage is good. "Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing," the Proverbs writer would say. We know likewise that marriage is for our protection. 1 Corinthians 7:9, if you cannot control those desirous passions, then Paul says, get married. It's a beautiful place for that love to be expressed. We also know this, that marriage is for our joy. "Rejoice in the wife of thy youth," again, the Proverbs writer would say. And then we know also that marriage is sacred. It is sacred because it is divine in origin. God never intended for physical intimacy between a man and a woman to be safe. He intended for it to be sacred. And when it's sacred, that takes care of the other. And so marriage is sacred. It was and is God ordained. But this morning we want to look at some practical admonition for marriage in an Old Testament book, the book of Ruth. You will find Ruth, very small book, only 4 chapters. It is between the book of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. And so I want us to first of all consider the setting of the book of Ruth. This particular account begins with a woman named Naomi and her husband Elimelech in Moab. Now they were originally from Judea, particularly from Bethlehem, the place where our Lord would eventually be born. And this couple had two sons, according to verse 2 of the book of Ruth, Mahlon and Chilion. And they would marry women in Moab. And the wives' names, Orpah and Ruth. And so as you study the first chapter, you learn that the husband of Naomi, Elimelech, would die in Moab. And eventually the two sons would die. And ultimately the widow Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. Now the reason she was in Moab was because there'd been a famine in the land. And now she hears the Lord's been gracious again. And so she's going to return to the homeland. These two daughters-in-law, who were very faithful to their mother-in-law, wanted to go with her. And she would not allow it. You do not need to go with me. One reason is Naomi, in her mind, life is over. She really doesn't have a lot for which to live. At least that's what she thinks. She does not want to further depress these two daughters-in-law. You stay here in your homeland. You marry again here. And eventually Orpah would give in to Naomi's request. She would embrace her mother-in-law and with tears walk away. But Ruth would not do that. And in chapter 1 of the in the book of Ruth, you have some of the most beautiful language ever spoken between two people. And sometimes these verses that we're going to consider here for just a moment are verses that are quoted in a marriage ceremony. Nothing wrong with that. But these words were spoken between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. In verse 16, here is what Ruth said to Naomi. She says, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Beautiful language between Ruth and Naomi. And so Ruth goes with Naomi. She goes to the homeland of Naomi, the place where her husband had been born. And there in the homeland, Ruth wants to do everything she can to take care of Naomi. And so Ruth finds out about Naomi's kinsman by the name of Boaz. And so she says, I'm going to go and seek to get grain in this man's field. And so it is that Naomi is in agreement with that, seeing that this man is a near kinsman. Now, according to the Levirate law of marriage, that's very important, isn't it? Because Ruth would want to have a husband. And Naomi knew that in order for the inheritance to be claimed, it must be redeemed. And so we will find that Naomi is going to urge Ruth to seek Boaz as a husband. He is among the kinsmen, among the redeemers. He is not the closest kinsman, but he is a near kinsman. And so that near kinsman would marry the widow, continue the family line, and retain the inheritance. And so Naomi has to have just a little bit of hope that something might just happen between Ruth and the very wealthy landowner Boaz, who is near kinsman to Naomi's husband. Well, Ruth goes into the field of Boaz, and she takes whatever's left over from the reapers. And eventually the wealthy but also very cordial and generous Boaz comes upon the scene, and he greets the reapers. And then he asks about the damsel who is gleaning in his fields. He wants to know more about her. And these reapers say to Boaz, this is Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And so it is that Boaz then wants to meet Ruth. And something is happening right here between verses 7 and 8 that I think is important. You can tell that Boaz, like most men, when they first begin to feel a connection, it is through what the man sees. He's very attractive to this woman, Ruth. And he says to Ruth, don't you go anywhere else and glean. He says, I want you to work here work in my fields, glean in my fields, reap what my men reap. You partake of the water that are given for the maidens. You're going to stay here. You're not going anywhere else. And she is very, very gracious in her acceptance of his invitation to work in his fields and to glean from his fields. Now this news, when she would take it to Naomi, would be exciting news for the very depressed Naomi. And Naomi knew this was a good thing. And Naomi knew there evidently had to be a connection here between Boaz and Ruth. But Naomi has to be thinking this just might work out. I don't think Naomi, who is like a mother to Ruth, and certainly one who's very concerned about her husband and her son's legacy, I don't think she's a lot different from the rest of us when it comes to our children and who they marry. One woman said to me, she said, I love the young man my daughter is dating. She said, oh, shh. She said, I don't want her to know anything about it. Because as soon as she understands how much I love that young man, she'll probably call it off. And she said, I don't want it to be called off. I love this young man. He's good. And so Boaz was a good man. And Naomi knew enough about Boaz, the near kinsman, that he'd be a good husband to Ruth. And so it is that Naomi encourages Ruth to go to him at night. Find the place where he's sleeping and reverently lie at his feet. And that's what Ruth did. And she made it known to him that he was a near kinsman. And she basically proposed to him. And Boaz says, I'll do what you want. But he says, there's one a little closer than I am. And he says, but I am going to do everything I can to buy this back, to redeem the inheritance, so that I can marry you. The two have fallen in love, haven't they? And he wants to honor this request made by Ruth. When Naomi hears this news, Naomi is excited because she knows what this means. She can understand what Boaz is about to do. He's going to do whatever is needed to be able to marry Ruth. And of course, we know that as the story continues into chapter 4, that indeed the next in line to marry the widow Ruth is not willing to pay for the inheritance. It would put his own inheritance in jeopardy. And so he hands over a sandal, which in that particular custom meant, I am turning this over to you. I am giving up this inheritance. And so Boaz would purchase that, redeem the inheritance, and marry Ruth. Now that's just an overview of what you have in 4 chapters of the book of Ruth. But we're interested in something we can learn today that is practical, something that we can learn from Boaz and Ruth that might be helpful to all of us. And the first thing that I have noticed as I've been studying this for quite some time is that whenever you marry somebody, you marry the family. All right? Sometimes people say, well, I'm not marrying the family. Yes, you are. You can't avoid it. Boaz understood this, that in order for him to get Naomi, or rather Ruth, he got Naomi. If he did not get Naomi and win her over, he wouldn't get Ruth. He understood that. Marrying Ruth meant also Naomi comes with it. You say, well, why is that so tough? Well, in every family, we've got some tough people with whom we have to deal, right? Sometimes they're called in-laws, sometimes outlaws. Naomi is a bitter woman. She suffers from depression. She's not had a smile on her face in years. And Boaz is going to have to deal with that, isn't he? Somebody said it's probably like this. When Boaz went to visit Naomi's home, he had to try to compliment all the black drapery she had in that house because she was so depressed. But he had to deal with that. Boaz wants Ruth, and with Ruth comes Naomi. And so here are some practical matters we need to consider when getting married. You marry the family. Now I want to say this. Naomi has had a hard life, hasn't she? I mean, she still trusts in God, but her faith really has been tested. But Boaz does something wonderful to make sure that he can get Naomi on his side. And so in chapter 3, I want you to notice that when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, verse 16, Naomi says, "Who art thou, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done to her. And she said, "These 6 measures of barley gave he me, for he said to me, Go not empty unto whom? Thy mother-in-law." And so Boaz wants Ruth. He knows to get Ruth, he has to also be generous and kind to Naomi. Here's the point. Don't gripe about your in-laws. Love them. All right? Your husband or your wife may say things about their parents that don't always seem nice. And in your mind, you're thinking, honey, I agree with everything you're saying. But don't do that. Your responsibility is not to react the same way, but rather to love them. If your children see something going on in the extended family that's not right, then in private explain or try to explain these family members. And that while we certainly don't appreciate some of the things that are done by family members, we still love them. And try to teach your children to respect them. When you marry a man or a woman, whatever the case may be, you marry a family. I heard the story of a couple who had to take in the husband's father. He was now an aged man. And when that man was brought in to live with them, he was suffering from dementia. Not only that, this particular man, when he ate, he was just like a baby. He was no longer clean. He made a mess. It would just about make you sick to sit at the same table with this old man. And finally, this husband and wife had enough. And they decided what we're going to do is we're going to get a trough, put it over in the corner, put a chair there, and that's where he'll eat. And that's what they started doing. The old man would sit in the corner, eating from a wooden trough, just like a pig, because the children said that's what he's like. Sometime after that, the husband, father in this family, saw his little boy outside with some pieces of wood, some hammer and nails, and he asked his son, "Son, what are you doing?" The little boy said this. He said, "I'm building a trough so that one day you'll have it when you get old and can't sit at the table and eat with us." It didn't take long, but that old man was back at the table very soon, right? Yeah. When you get married, you marry the whole family. And Boaz understood that. I want Ruth, but to get Ruth, that means I also get Naomi. And that's all right. Because Boaz said, here's how I'm going to win Naomi. I'll be nothing but good to her. And as this story progresses, you would see that ultimately he would indeed win over Naomi. She loved Boaz. And he helped to bring joy back to her life. But here's a second point I want us to consider. And that is, in marriage, we need to learn all that we can about the opposite gender. Boaz and Ruth needed to learn about the other, and I think they committed themselves to that end. You've heard me say this before. You better watch out for that fellow who says he understands everything about a woman. He'll lie about other things too, right? You've heard me say that. But I also add this very quickly. The ladies don't understand us either, all right? And nothing is wrong with that. Nothing wrong with these differences whatsoever. It's been over 25 years now since John Gray wrote his book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. You remember that? And of course, what happens in his story is a group of women from Venus have arrived on Earth and a group of men from Mars have arrived on Earth, and they speak different languages. At first they're drawn to one another, but then they become very, very frustrated because one speaks Venetian, the other speaks Martian, and they don't understand each other, and they're ready to give up on each other. Ready to go back to their respective planets. And so it is that sometimes we realize that one of the major problems in the marriage relationship is just simple communication, because we communicate differently. Imagine going into a foreign country. You don't know the language, but you've got to stay there for an extended period of time, but you don't want to learn the language. And so as a result of that, you get frustrated, you become annoyed, and eventually you just say, I'm leaving. That's exactly what happens in marriage, isn't it? Two people join themselves together as one, they don't understand the language, and eventually they just say, well, let's just forget this idea. And yet I'm convinced that we need and we can learn the languages of each other. Now here's what happens in this particular text. You go back to Ruth chapter 3, and you know where it is that verse 17 where Ruth said, these 6 measures of barley is what Boaz gave to me, and he said, don't go empty-handed to your mother-in-law. Listen to what Naomi says. Sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall. For the man will not be in rest until he have finished the thing this day. Now what thing? Going to the near kinsman and saying, hey, I want her. If you're not going to claim the inheritance, I will. I'll bite back. I'll redeem it. And Naomi says, I read this clearly. I know what old Boaz is about to do. How did Naomi know this? She spoke Martian, that's why. Right? She had been married to Elimelech. She had those 2 sons. She watched how they wooed and courted their wives. She knows exactly what Boaz is doing. She says, let me tell you something, Boaz is going to act on this quickly because Ruth, he loves you. It's going to happen quickly. And so what we find here is 2 people who, in my judgment, are wanting to get to know each other really, really well. Now, some couples aren't like that. There was one man who finally agreed to go to one of these marriage seminars. Usually it's the women who want to go. And finally a man agreed he'd go to the marriage seminar. And when he went to the marriage seminar, the speaker of that program said, I want to tell you, husband, something. You need to know the favorite flower of your wife. One man turned to his wife and he says, I don't know why I'm here. He said, I know that. This is easy. Your favorite flower, Pillsbury all-purpose. Let's go home, right? He missed it, didn't he? Missed it completely. And so there was this failure to communicate. Now, most couples get married thinking what? Well, my mate will learn my language. As long as he or she stays with me, you notice I look down here every once in a while to see how this is going. But she will learn my language. But that's not how it happens. Those of us who are in the marriage relationship, we have to decide, are we going to learn our mate or not? I need to study her language. She needs to study my language. No, you see, there initially in that relationship, we cannot understand why it is that while I'm watching a sports broadcast or looking at ESPN on my phone, she wants to talk. The man says that's rude. On the other hand, she's thinking, why is it when I want to talk, he seems more interested in the sports program? In her estimation, that's rude. And it probably is. But here's what we've got to do, is instead of focusing upon our own language, focus upon the mate's language. You see, a successful marriage hinges on a new attitude about differences. Let's just go ahead and settle it. God made us different. Men and women are different. And as you've heard me preach before, God made us different that He might make us one. But if God made us different that He might make us one, that is a good thing, because everything God does is good. Now, if we focus on our differences, then we fail in the marriage relationship. If our focus is, how can I change my mate to be just like I want him or her to be, then the marriage is going to fail. And so there really is something to this idea that opposites attract. Don't you love that? But when opposites attract, don't let that be a problem. When you find that you're in a relationship and because you're opposites, that's what's brought you together, let that make the marriage interesting. And let it make it exciting. And let it make it enjoyable. When I was a boy, I loved reading the Guinness Book of World Records. And I learned a lot of those facts that were found in the Guinness Book of World Records. And one thing that I found very interesting is a picture of the conjoined twins Chang and Ing Bunker, joined at the hip. And it was amazing to me that two people could live life joined at the hip. And they had, of course, to do everything in rhythm. One couldn't just decide he's going this way. They had to decide to go together. And so it is that when a couple gets married, you're no longer solo, right? There is somebody that really is like joined to the hip. And therefore, in order for this to succeed, you've got to learn everything about one another. You've got to learn the other's language. Here's the third point I want to mention. Just practical matters. That in the marriage relationship, it is a 100% proposition. Now, with most relationships, what do we say? 50-50. Meet each other halfway. That might work in most relationships. It will not work in the marriage relationship. Now, when we go to Ephesians chapter 5 and we start talking about what Paul said to the wife and what he said to the husbands, we usually start in verse 22, you know, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as unto the Lord. But every couple ought to start in verse 21, shouldn't they? Where it says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. So there is actually a submission on the part of each one. I like this line. Sometimes you've got to go every inch of every frustrating mile to make a marriage work. And that's very, very true. From the very beginning, Boaz was willing to pay the price in order that he might have Ruth. And what was that? 100% commitment. And what was his reward? 100% commitment from Ruth. Just go to chapter 2 again and look at that language between the two. I mean, if you read it, some of you may be tempted to say, that's almost sickening, it's so sweet. But just listen how they start out talking to one another, and I'm convinced how they always spoke to each other. In verse 7, here is Ruth saying, I pray you, please let me glean in your fields. And Boaz says, listen, don't you dare go to another field, right? Don't you go to another field. And not only that, you go out there with those reapers and you help yourself. And when you're thirsty, you get you a drink. And then she bowed herself down before him, as would have been custom in that particular time. And she says, I have found such grace in your eyes. You are so sweet to me, seeing that I'm a stranger here. And then verse 11, he comes back saying, you're not a stranger here. I've heard everything about you. I know how good you've been to Naomi. He brings her up again. He says, I know how good you've been to Naomi, I know how you left your country. I know you've come here. And now may our God be gracious and good to you. And then she says, verse 13, let me find favor in your sight. You've comforted me so much. You've spoken friendly to me. And then, of course, Boaz, in turn to this woman, makes it clear. Verse 14, he says, you know, won't you come have dinner with me? And let's talk some more. And let's get to know one another better. Doesn't a relationship where there are two people attracted to one another usually end up with that particular invitation? Why don't we go out and let's have dinner together? In this couple, you will see 100% cooperation between the two. 100% commitment. Now, I want to say this, young people, there is something very, very popular today, and it's called cohabitation, living together without being married. Now, there was a time in our society where that was a shame, and it still ought to be. And there are people today who think, you know, well, we're just going to live together, and then we'll figure out whether we ought to get married or not. I remember many years ago hearing a young person who was reared in the church, was a young Christian girl, and she said, you know, we all understand it would be better if we could live together before we get married, but God says don't do that, so we can't do it. She missed it, didn't she? God doesn't tell us to do something that's not good for us. If God says don't do it, then it means it's in our best interest not to do it. And so God does not want men and women living together as husband and wife if they've not come together in the marriage union. What happens is this. We have people today all around us. They share the same bed, same house, same bills, all those things, but they don't share the same what? Commitment. And did you know that research, studies have clearly shown that in these type of relationship, there's more domestic violence. There's more depression. There likewise is more of a tendency to cheat. And when this couple who's living together without marriage finally decides to get married, oftentimes that will end in divorce. What do we learn from Ruth and Boaz and from the most successful marriages in history? They require a 100% commitment on the part of both. Young people, don't give in to what's happening around you. Don't give in to this cohabitation that says you ought to live together before you get married. What will make your marriage strong is this, deciding beforehand, we are 100% committed to this relationship, and it will be until death us do part. Ruth and Boaz had that kind of marriage. So what are some of the practical things we've learned today in this message? Number one, when you get married, you marry the family, don't you? Number two, get to know your mate. If you have the idea that I'm more interested in what she's about and finding out why she does what she does and try to learn that instead of trying to make that person after my own self, after my image, be much better. And then finally, give it 100% of your commitment. Now, this marriage did indeed take place. Ruth became the wife of Boaz. And then some great things happened. One thing is Naomi smiled again, didn't she? Because over in verse 13 we find that Boaz took Ruth. This is chapter 4. Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. And the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne him. And Naomi took the child, and laid it in her bosom, and became nurse unto it. Boaz intended, didn't he, all along to make sure that Naomi would smile again, and it happened. A little child was born to Ruth and to Boaz, and they named that little boy Obed, who was the father of Jesse. And Jesse had a whole bunch of sons, and among them David, the sweet singer of Israel, who would be the king of God's people. And go to Matthew 1 and you look at the genealogy, and you find that from David, who was also from Ruth, came the Christ child, who today, to you and me, is our kinsman, our Redeemer. Jesus did for us what Boaz did for Ruth and her family. He bought us back. What a beautiful story from the Old Testament. A beautiful story about marriage, but one that points us to the Christ, our near kinsman and Redeemer. This morning, it doesn't make any difference if your life, including your marriage, is torn apart. There is the Christ who came from Boaz and Ruth. He's available to help change your home. Behind me, unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Is the Lord building your house? He wants to do that. He wants to build your house. He wants to construct your life if you'll let Him. And that begins with humbly responding in obedience to His divine will as a believer who's willing to confess Jesus and be baptized upon repentance. Would you do that this morning? Let's stand and sing.